in terms of the sort of phylogenetic neighbor networks that you've been working on. You know, that's stuff I'm sure you've taken even further by now, right? And so I thought maybe just to ask you about kind of where you've done recently and where you see your work going.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, our work is on the plant genetics and evolution side of things, as you know, and we try to bring in interesting traits as well to try and understand the genetics of those traits, right? So we've got, we can't do a whole lot with measuring the chemistry ourselves, but people have given us data sets that include now tens of thousands of different samples worth of chemistry data on these plants. And so now we can understand a lot about, from our work on the plant genetic side, and then through these collaborations, how some of the genetic diversity that we're looking at relates to some of the chemical diversity on the plant side of things. And it's become clear to me that, as I'm sure you and your students have started to appreciate, I mean, you certainly do, the cannabis is not just one thing. I mean, it's a huge diversity of different genotypes, from my point of view, but with very different effects on humans or other animals. And so we've started to uncover some of that diversity. I think we're only scratching the surface, but there's definitely a diversity of different major lineages of cannabis that differ in a lot of different ways, including at the chemistry level. And we know that that's not just from one compound, it's from dozens of different compounds that interact in complex ways. A brief summary of a lot of the sort of the overarching picture. In terms of the specifics, we've analyzed over 1,000 different cannabis genomes now, and we can identify at least 7 different major lineages, and there's probably a lot more than that within the species, and some of them differ by more than the level of diversity between humans and chimpanzees. So that's a different genus, right? But it's all within the species, and that's because it every plant that anybody's looked at can intercross with all the other cannabis plants. So that's why they're all put together into one species, right? So that's the basic species concept that people are using to define cannabis as one species, is they can all interbreed. But from my point of view as a plant sort of evolutionary biologist and geneticist, it's a really interesting plant because of the diversity that one species has certainly on the genetic side, but also on the geographic side, on the ecological side, on the trait side of things. So the plant, the native range is probably from Western Europe all the way to far Eastern Asia and into Japan, and from pretty far north into Siberia all the way down to the tropics, and then south of the equator from there, pretty far into Africa. So probably extremely wide geographic range with a huge amount of ecological diversity across that range, and from sea level all the way up to, there have been some reports of populations growing well over 10,000 feet in the Himalayas. And so a tremendous amount of diversity of different kinds of habitats, and probably the diversity of chemistry is related to some aspect of that. So some of these compounds you see in one lineage, and you see very different chemistry in other lineages. That's probably not just due to human selection. I think there's been a lot of diversity in the wild, probably defense against insects or other natural enemies of the plant, probably some aspect of that, maybe pathogens or parasites of different kinds that these compounds are protecting against. That's not very well understood in terms of cannabis specifically, because basically there's really only one published study really relating to that at all that I've seen, and that is that THC does reduce the growth rate of some generalist insect herbivores, but is that really why they evolved? A lot more work needs to happen, and it's probably just like, well, so a lot of times we focus on how diverse and unique the chemistry is of cannabis. And it does provide a puzzle in terms of why and how that diversity evolved. But although the cannabinoids are unique to cannabis, it's not really as unique a story as a lot of times people make it out to be, because a lot of other lineages of plants also have their own different unique chemistry, right? So it's not the cannabinoids, it's something else. And usually the reasoning behind that seems to be some kind of defense against pathogens and herbivores. Sometimes there's also a role of attracting beneficial partners of some kinds, like maybe attracting a wasp that eats or parasitizes some of the insects that predate on it, or it could be attracting a seed disperser or a pollinator or something like that in some species. In cannabis, it's wind pollinated, so they don't need to attract a pollinator, but they certainly could be attracting seed dispersers or something that eats one of their enemies or something like that.
So I think what you're saying really plays into this notion that it's complicated, and it certainly gives rise to the potential for this entourage effect, right? Or certainly many different effects, which can then be combined, obviously. So just to circle back for a minute, and because I put up some of your plots. And highlighted, even though there's like 1,000 genomes in there and you can't really see, individual strains, I would blow them up for people. And of course, people find it fascinating, like the feral Nebraska weed, right? So where did you find feral Nebraska weed?
No, actually, that's something that we didn't collect ourselves, but basically that's one of many samples that people donated the DNA for, a lot of feral material is being collected by different growers and brought into Colorado cultivation. We're not going to other states and collecting things, but if people give us DNA or DNA sequence, that's what we can do. That's what we can deal with, and so that is a limitation on our work, is we can't go. I'd love to be able to go to Siberia and collect wild populations, and then go to the tops of the Himalayas and collect the highest populations I can find, and look at how they each are adapting to the unique but cold environments that they're in, or all kinds of different. There's a lot of different wild populations or different domesticated populations I'd love to work with, but we are very much limited by the legal aspects. Nevertheless, to get back to your question, there's a tremendous diversity of wild plants growing all across the Midwest and other parts of the U.S. Those populations are now being recognized as potentially very valuable by a lot of this up-and-coming generation of hemp breeders and growers who want to now bring these feral populations back into cultivation. So again, because actually in the past, those populations were mainly cultivated for fiber, for use in World War II, because the military needed hemp fiber for a number of their different materials that they required. And then after World War II, it was made illegal again, and it hasn't been cultivated except in more recent years in Colorado and Kentucky and a few other places. But now there's this big challenge of trying to find the right kind of genetic material for a new set of purposes related to the medical side of things, where the main value of the crop today is something that people hadn't in the past selected for, which is high levels of CBD and other compounds, which, as far as I know, had not been intentionally selected for until very recently. So now there's all this big push to try and develop new and better material that's totally different than anything people had used before, and so that's, from my point of view as a plant geneticist and evolutionary biologist, it's a really interesting case of really rapid, strong selection for something totally new, and then we can look at how that actually happens, but also create tools that could be used to make that happen more efficiently, just on the plant breeding side of things.
That's very cool. Just a quick note for the audience too about you mentioned the legal barriers, right? And you are not allowed to, nor am I, to go and we have any interaction with plant material, basically, right? We can't touch it. We can't.
I can grow hemp, which includes some material that now does have potential medically relevant effects, because hemp is just defined based on the level of THC. And so as long as it doesn't have high levels of THC.
By the way, I'm envious. Your job sounds like so much fun. And if you ever get a chance to go to Siberia and the Himalayas, I'd love to come along with you, because that sounds like a lot of fun.
And in some of these places, I mean, I don't know about in Siberia, but in some of these places like Nepal or Bhutan or some of these places, it would be so interesting to not just go and collect the material for my uses, but also find out more about the traditional uses of the plant and how people there view the plant from a sort of a psychological point of view. How does I think that it seems like there could be some really interesting sort of local knowledge about these plants that could be interesting to bring into it.
Well, listen, Nolan, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me.